Mark Tanner had always dreamed of being a reporter, one who would break the big story, uncover secrets that shook the world, and make a name for himself in the bustling heart of a city. But after finishing journalism school with a few small-time stories under his belt, Mark found himself in a place far quieter and more remote than he'd imagined. Black Hollow, a town with a population just over 5,000, wasn't the kind of place where major scandals or groundbreaking exposes were waiting to be discovered. Yet, it was exactly where Mark was now, sitting at a worn-out desk at the Black Hollow Gazette, staring at a stack of dusty, yellowed newspapers from decades ago. He had hoped for something more dynamic, something that could catapult his career. But here he was in this sleepy town, where the most exciting things seemed to be school board meetings and the annual pie contest at the county fair. Mark had only been in Black Hollow for a week, but it already felt like a lifetime. The town was quiet, eerily so. Its main street was lined with old brick buildings, the paint peeling off their sides. Some were long abandoned, their windows boarded up and their doorways dark. A few shops managed to stay open, but not many. The most action he'd seen so far was an elderly man feeding pigeons at the town square, and the occasional car creeping down the cracked, narrow roads that lined the town. The people here kept to themselves, and Mark had quickly learned that it wasn't just the town that was isolated, it was the people too. But the quietness, although somewhat unsettling, wasn't what bothered Mark. It was the whispers, the stories that seemed to be everywhere but nowhere at the same time. I'm telling you, it's the kid at the bus stop. His new neighbor had said one morning while they stood in front of their apartment building. You can feel it, that cold, like he's not quite real. Mark had smiled politely, nodding as if he believed her. She was a sweet old woman named Margaret who seemed to know everything about everyone, from their medical history to the color of their curtains. But she had also spoken about the tag-along kids, a group of mysterious children that supposedly followed people around town late at night, their eyes unnaturally black, their presence always just out of reach. Another conversation at the diner with a waitress named Claire turned just as odd. As she handed him a coffee, she casually remarked, "You're new here, huh? You know this town's got its share of strange happenings, urban legends. Most people keep quiet about it, but you'll hear them if you're paying attention. The thing is, no one talks about it. It's like a curse." She went on to mention the Hollow Man, an apparition that supposedly roams the streets after midnight, waiting for the unwary. Mark chuckled nervously, dismissing it as typical small-town gossip. He didn't believe in legends or ghosts, but the strange feeling of being watched by invisible eyes lingered. It was something he couldn't shake. Even the air in Black Hollow had a weight to it, a heaviness, like the past had never really let go. In the days that followed, Mark continued his research at the Black Hollow Gazette, digging into local news clippings, archives, and city records. Most of the headlines were unremarkable, local events, some car accidents, the usual string of minor crimes. But as he combed through the old records, something unusual caught his attention. A series of mysterious disappearances, stretching back for decades, each involving individuals who were never seen again after dark. The police reports were vague, with no clear leads or explanations. Rumors had circulated about those who vanished, but no one ever seemed to discuss it openly. The deeper Mark dug, the more unsettled he became. It wasn't just the strange disappearances. There was something about the way the locals spoke, quiet, cautious, as if they were afraid to say too much. People here didn't just live in Black Hollow, they survived it. Mark had heard of towns with secrets before, but this one felt different. It was as if the town itself had an eerie presence, pressing down on its inhabitants, keeping them in place. Sitting in the small office that afternoon, Mark glanced at the stack of papers in front of him, the yellowing clippings of old stories about Black Hollow's strange occurrences. Maybe, just maybe, there was something here worth investigating. He looked out the window at the empty street, the light fading as dusk settled over the town. The air was growing cooler, the sound of cicadas beginning to fill the silence. Mark stretched and stood up, ready to leave for the night, when something caught his eye. A figure at the far end of the street, small, silhouetted against the fading sky. The figure turned quickly, disappearing into the shadows before Mark could get a clear look. His heart skipped a beat, but when he went outside to check, the street was empty. Mark shivered, dismissing the strange sensation as nothing more than his overactive imagination. He had just arrived in town and was still adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings. There were no ghosts or children lurking in the shadows, but as he stepped back into his apartment, the feeling that something was watching him, waiting just out of sight, clung to him. Mark tried to shake it off, telling himself that it was just the stories getting to him. The following morning, Mark felt more determined than ever. Maybe there was nothing to the stories the locals told. Maybe the disappearances had a logical explanation. But one thing was for sure. Black Hollow had a history, and Mark Tanner, the young reporter, was about to uncover it, whether he was ready for it or not. Mark's first assignment as a reporter in Black Hollow was nothing more than a simple piece about the town's most popular diner, Benny's Gravy Train. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but it was a start, and he knew that even the most mundane stories could provide valuable insights into a town's character. The owner, Benny, was a local legend in his own right, an eccentric, larger-than-life figure who had been serving up greasy breakfasts for over 30 years. Mark was eager to get this assignment out of the way and start working on something more substantial. Armed with a notebook and a half-hearted smile, he made his way to the bus stop, feeling the quiet hum of the town around him. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as the bus pulled up with its usual tired screech. He climbed aboard, swiping his pass as he scanned the sparse group of passengers. The bus wasn't crowded at this time of day, which suited Mark just fine. He took a seat by the window, watching the sleepy streets of Black Hollow pass by. The bus rumbled along the cracked roads, its engine a steady drone that blended into the background of the town's quiet pulse. But just as he was beginning to settle into the ride, something caught his eye. A man sitting across from him, hunched and frail, had been staring at him for what seemed like an eternity. At first, Mark thought it was just the kind of accidental gaze you get when you're both lost in your thoughts. But there was something unsettling about the old man's eyes, piercing, as if they were seeing through him rather than looking at him. His face was weathered, lined with age, and his clothes were ragged, as though he hadn't changed them in days. He didn't seem to fit the usual demographic of the bus riders, who were mostly office workers and school children. The old man's eyes locked with Mark's, and for a moment the world outside the bus seemed to disappear. It was as if the air between them thickened and the noise of the bus faded into a dull hum. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity of the stare. "Don't worry about it," the old man's voice rasped suddenly, breaking the silence. Mark froze, surprised by the unexpected interruption. "You're new here, aren't you?" The man's voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it carried with it a weight that made Mark's skin crawl. Mark hesitated before responding. "Yeah, I just moved here," he said, his tone polite but distant. He wasn't sure how to engage with the strange man without being rude. The old man leaned in slightly, his face coming closer, his breath heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and something else, something foul. His eyes never left Mark's. "You'll learn quickly. There are things that follow people in this town, things that can't be shaken off." Mark swallowed hard. He had heard the rumors, people speaking in hushed tones about strange happenings in Black Hollow, about things that lurked in the dark. But it was all just local lore, wasn't it? The man continued, his voice slow and deliberate, like he was sharing a secret. "The bus doesn't take you where you want to go. It takes you where it needs you to be. Mark my words." He paused, giving Mark a long, penetrating look. "And you'd better hope you don't see them. They're patient. You know, they wait for the right moment." Mark's unease grew. The man's cryptic words were sending a chill up his spine. What was he talking about? Things that follow. They wait for the right moment. Was this just some local eccentric spouting off nonsense, or was there something deeper to his ramblings? The bus hit a pothole, jolting Mark back to reality. He glanced around at the other passengers, but no one seemed to pay the old man any mind. Some were lost in their own worlds, reading newspapers or fiddling with their phones, while others stared out the window, oblivious to the conversation taking place. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He wasn't superstitious. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or strange forces. This was just an old man, probably suffering from dementia or some kind of mental illness, spouting off nonsense to anyone who would listen. But the words stuck with him as the bus continued its route through the empty streets of Black Hollow. "The town knows," the old man added suddenly, his voice almost a whisper now. "It watches, always watching." His words trailed off as he fell into silence once again, his eyes returning to their eerie, unblinking stare. Mark, eager to get away from the uncomfortable conversation, looked out the window, pretending not to hear the man anymore. The bus rolled past the rows of houses, the fading light casting long shadows on the streets. He told himself it was just the quiet of the town playing tricks on him. Soon enough, the bus pulled into the stop near Benny's gravy train, and Mark stood up, trying to ignore the lingering unease that had crept into his thoughts. He stepped off the bus and into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the conversation still pressing on him. He glanced back at the bus, but the old man was no longer visible. Maybe he was just an old man, living alone and talking to himself. Mark shook his head, trying to clear his mind of the cryptic words. He had work to do, and Benny's diner wasn't going to right itself. As he walked toward the diner, the feeling that something was watching him grew stronger. He turned his head, half expecting to see the old man following him, but there was nothing, just the empty streets of Black Hollow. Still, something about the encounter lingered. Mark tried to dismiss it, but deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that the old man's words weren't just meaningless ramblings. The mention of things that followed, the eerie calmness in his tone, it all felt too real to ignore. By the time Mark reached Benny's gravy train, he had already decided to forget about the strange man on the bus. After all, there were stories like this everywhere, weren't there? Every town had its odd characters. He just chalked this one up to an eccentric old man who had seen too much of the world and wasn't quite all there anymore. But as he pushed open the door to the diner and the warmth of the kitchen hit him, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he was already too deep into Black Hollow to turn back. Mark had grown accustomed to the strange stillness of Black Hollow, but it was the children, always the children, that began to unsettle him. At first, he'd thought little of it. He'd noticed a few kids at the bus stops in the mornings and evenings, but it was hardly unusual. Children waiting for the bus were a common sight in any town. However, there was something different about the kids in Black Hollow. They weren't the usual noisy, energetic bunch. They were quiet, unnervingly so, and many of them seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Mark first noticed it one crisp autumn evening just after work. He was walking down to the bus stop near Benny's Gravy Train, his usual route home. The fading daylight painted the town in soft hues of orange and purple, and the streetlights flickered to life one by one as the evening deepened. At the stop, he saw 3 kids standing together, huddled close, but oddly silent. They looked out of place, dressed in old clothes, their faces pale under the dim light. The strangest thing, though, was how they stared at him as he approached, not with curiosity or interest, but with something else. There was an emptiness in their eyes, as if they were waiting for something or perhaps someone. Mark's footsteps slowed as he neared them. He was too far away to see their eyes clearly, but he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Something about the way they stood, unmoving, unsettled him. It was like they were not part of the town. They didn't belong here, and yet they were always there. He shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to his growing unease with the town. But the feeling lingered as he caught the attention of one of the kids, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She was the smallest of the group, with dark, stringy hair that fell into her face. She watched him approach, her gaze steady and unblinking. "Excuse me," Mark said, forcing a smile as he neared. He didn't know why he felt the need to speak, but something about the girl made him feel compelled. "Are you waiting for someone?" The girl didn't answer at first, just stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Mark began to feel awkward, as though he were intruding on something he wasn't supposed to understand. The other children remained silent, their faces expressionless, almost like they were waiting for a cue. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice soft but chilling. "We're waiting for the bus." Her words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them that made Mark's stomach turn. It wasn't a statement, it was an affirmation, as if she were stating a fact that held some deeper meaning. "The bus," Mark echoed, trying to shake off the feeling that had begun to creep up his spine. "But there's no bus this late." The girl's lips barely moved as she smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. "It's coming. It always does." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but he was interrupted by the soft hum of the bus engine approaching in the distance. He glanced down the road, barely making out the headlights of the bus creeping through the twilight. When he turned back to the children, the girl was no longer looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the road, her expression unchanged. Something about the way she said, "It always does," gnawed at him. There was a certainty in her voice, an unsettling calm that made his heart race. He glanced at the other 2 children, but they had not moved. They stood like statues, their eyes locked on the bus as it grew closer. As the bus pulled up to the stop, Mark felt a jolt of discomfort. The doors opened, but the children didn't move. They simply stared ahead, unmoving, until the bus driver gave an impatient honk of the horn. It was only then that the girl turned to Mark, her face expressionless, and said, "You're not supposed to get on." Mark froze, caught off guard by the remark. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But the girl's words stuck with him like an omen. He shook it off, dismissing it as just another oddity of the town. The children, without a word, boarded the bus together, their movements slow and deliberate. Mark watched them disappear inside before the doors closed and the bus slowly pulled away into the growing darkness. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty stop before turning to leave. But something in the air had shifted. The moment he turned to walk away, he noticed the chill. The night had suddenly grown colder, the air biting against his skin. He didn't know why, but he quickened his pace, the unease tightening in his chest. The next day, Mark overheard something he had hoped he would never hear. He was having coffee at the diner when Claire, the waitress, mentioned the tag-along kids. "They show up around here now and then," Claire said, speaking casually as she wiped down the counter. "Don't know where they come from, but they're always hanging around the bus stops late at night." Mark furrowed his brow, his stomach churning. Tag-along kids. Claire glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then leaned in closer. "It's just a story, you know. People here talk about them. Kids with black eyes. They don't talk much, but they follow people. They get too close, they just watch." Mark almost laughed, dismissing it as another one of those bizarre local legends that seemed to thrive in Black Hollow. He had heard plenty of stories like it before in other small towns, tales about spirits or strange figures that roamed at night, but none of it seemed to hold any weight. Still, the image of the kids from the bus stop lingered in his mind. The girl's eyes, that strange, unsettling certainty. Mark shrugged it off, telling himself it was nothing more than a local myth. Yet, as the days passed, he couldn't help but notice them more and more. The children who never seemed to be with anyone, who watched from the shadows as if waiting for something to happen. And with every sighting, the stories Claire told him seemed to grow more real. He was trying to push it all out of his mind when, one late afternoon, Mark saw her again. The girl from the bus stop. This time, she was standing at the edge of town, just outside the grocery store. She wasn't waiting for a bus. She was just standing there, staring at the passing cars. Alone. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine as their eyes met. But this time he didn't approach. Instead, he quickly averted his gaze and walked faster, his heartbeat quickening. He could almost hear her voice in his head. It always does. The town's legends were beginning to feel far too real for comfort. It was an unusually crisp morning in Black Hollow when Mark sat down at Benny's gravy train, his notebook open and his coffee steaming beside him. He had already spent the better part of the morning trying to make sense of his latest assignment, a puff piece about the town's annual harvest festival. But his mind kept wandering back to the children. Those strange kids. The more he saw them, the more unsettled he became. But it wasn't just the kids, it was the feeling they left behind. It was as though something, or someone, was always lurking in the shadows just out of view. It had been a week since his last encounter with the girl, and the unease only grew. It wasn't long before the sensation that something was watching him became a constant presence. His every step in Black Hollow seemed to echo with a quiet tension that wasn't there before. "Morning, Mark," Pat said as he slid into the booth across from him, interrupting his thoughts. Pat had been with the Black Hollow Gazette for over a decade, a seasoned reporter whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Mark had come to admire Pat's ability to spin any mundane story into something intriguing, but he also knew that Pat had his own demons. The man's gruff exterior and dry sense of humor barely masked the weariness in his eyes. He'd seen too much, And it was that quiet, unspoken wait that made Pat both intimidating and intriguing. Pat slid a cup of coffee across the table, the steam curling up like a small ghost. "How's the writing going? Got that big piece on the harvest yet?" Mark chuckled, though his mind was elsewhere. "I'm working on it, but honestly, Pat, I think I've been losing focus lately. Something's off about this place." Pat raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "Oh, really? Welcome to Black Hollow." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze steady, but there was something in the way he looked at Mark, something knowing. Mark had spent enough time with Pat to recognize when the man was holding something back. Mark leaned forward, dropping his playful demeanor. "I'm serious. Lately, I've been noticing these kids around the bus stops. They don't seem to have any parents, and they're just there all the time, watching, never saying much." Pat's expression didn't change, but Mark could see the subtle tension in his face. He set his cup down, eyes never leaving Mark's. "You've seen them, huh?" Mark nodded, the unease returning as he thought back to the unsettling moments with the children. "Yeah. There's something strange about them, Pat. It's like they are always waiting for something. And the way they look at you, it's unsettling." Pat's eyes darkened, the light humor that usually lingered around him evaporating. For the first time, Mark saw something more in Pat, something heavier, something that spoke of experiences he had never shared. Pat looked around, his gaze sweeping the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers before lowering his voice. "You're not the only one who's noticed them." He sighed, a deep exhalation that seemed to carry years of burden. "I've seen them too, a long time ago when I first came here." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Pat shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "I used to be like you know, full of questions. A fresh face, eager to uncover all the stories this place had to offer. But those kids, they're not like normal kids, they're different." He paused, as if unsure whether to continue, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his cup. Mark's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean different? Are you saying they're dangerous?" Pat glanced around again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dangerous is one word for it, but it's more than that. They are not human, at least not entirely. When I first moved here, I heard the stories. The ones people don't talk about, they call them the tag-along kids around here. No one ever really explains where they come from, but there's this feeling, a feeling that they follow you. Wherever you go, they are there." Mark's skepticism flared up, but he held it back. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" Pat leaned forward, locking eyes with him, and for the first time Mark saw fear in his colleague's gaze. "I didn't. Not at first, but then I saw one just like you did. I didn't think much of it either, but that night it followed me, just like the stories said it would. Everywhere I went, there it was, watching, always watching." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Pat held up a hand, his voice growing more intense. "And then there's the eyes, that's the part that gets you. They don't blink. They don't show any emotion, just these black, empty pits. And when they look at you, you feel it in your gut. It's like they know something you don't, something you can't explain." Mark sat back, his mind racing. He had heard rumors, whispers in the corners of the diner from the older folks at the local bar. But hearing it from Pat, someone who had been in Black Hollow for years, made it feel real in a way that the stories hadn't. Still, Mark couldn't shake the disbelief that clung to him. It was all too strange, too out there. "And what happened?" Mark asked, his voice tentative. Pat took a long breath, as if remembering something he hadn't wanted to recall. "I followed one of them, just to see. I thought it was just some kid trying to mess with me, you know. But when I turned the corner, it was gone, and I mean gone. No sign of it, not even a shadow, like it never existed at all." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The coffee that had once been comforting now felt too hot against his skin. And you think, what, that there? Ghosts? Pat grimaced. I don't know, but I'm telling you they're not normal. And if you're smart, you'll stay away from them. Don't give them attention. Don't let them follow you home, because once they latch onto you, they don't leave. Mark tried to laugh it off, but something about Pat's tone, his raw sincerity, stopped him. You sound like you're speaking from experience, he said, his voice quieter now. Pat looked away, his gaze far off, like he was seeing something in the distance. You learn quickly around here, Mark. Black Hollow has its own way of handling things. And those kids, they're just the beginning. You don't want to know what else is waiting in the shadows. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. He had come to Black Hollow looking for stories, for something exciting. But now that excitement felt darker, more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Stay away from them, Pat repeated, his voice hard. Trust me, you don't want to get caught in whatever game they are playing. As Pat finished his coffee and stood to leave, Mark remained seated, his mind whirling. The stories, the warnings, the things Pat had shared, Mark tried to push them out of his head, but they clung to him like shadows in the corners of his mind. The more he tried to dismiss them, the more they seemed to make sense. There was something wrong about Black Hollow, and the children were at the heart of it. Pat's words echoed in his mind as he stared out the window, his unease deepening with every passing moment. Maybe there was more to these tag-along kids than he had thought. And maybe, just maybe, Pat was right. It wasn't too late to turn back. But Mark wasn't the type to back down. Not yet. For now, though, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. It was a chilly Thursday evening, when Mark found himself walking back from Benny's gravy train after another uneventful dinner. The night had settled in thick and heavy, the town draped in a blanket of silence, with only the occasional hum of a distant car engine breaking the stillness. As he walked, his mind wandered back to the conversation he'd had with Pat earlier that day. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man's warnings weren't just superstition, but something deeper, something real. Mark was accustomed to the dark quiet of Black Hollow, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed longer, deeper, and every creak of the old building sent a shiver down his spine. The streetlights flickered in that eerily familiar way, casting a weak glow on the sidewalk. It was late, and he could count on one hand the number of people still out in the streets. Black Hollow at night was a ghost town, but it wasn't an empty kind of silence. It was a watchful silence, the kind that made your skin prickle, as if the town itself was holding its breath. As he neared the bus stop, a cold wind rustled through the trees, snapping Mark out of his thoughts. He glanced toward the bench, half expecting to see no one, but there was a figure sitting there, a child, small and hunched, facing away from him. The child was alone. Mark paused. He didn't know why, but something about the sight made his heart skip. It was the middle of the night. Why was a child out here, alone at this hour? There were no buses coming through, not at this time. His hand instinctively reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers curling around the comforting shape of his phone. The child didn't move as Mark got closer. He could see now that the child was nervously shifting from side to side, his legs fidgeting as though he were trying to find a comfortable position, though he never quite succeeded. The child's head was slightly tilted downward, and his unkempt hair covered most of his face. Mark's footsteps slowed as he approached, a mix of curiosity and unease pushing him forward. The child still didn't acknowledge him, but Mark couldn't help but feel like the boy was aware of him, aware but not acknowledging him, as if he were simply waiting for the right moment. "Hey," Mark called out cautiously, his voice sounding strangely loud in the silence. "Are you okay?" The child didn't answer. He just kept rocking from side to side, his movements erratic and unsettling. Mark took another step closer, stopping just a few feet away. There was something about the boy's stillness that made Mark's chest tighten. "You shouldn't be out here this late," Mark continued, his voice faltering slightly. "Where are your parents?" No response. Mark's stomach tightened as the child's head shifted slightly, just enough to make Mark see the boy's face. The moment he saw the boy's eyes, his breath hitched. They were black, no whites, no irises, just an endless, abyssal blackness staring directly at him. Mark recoiled, instinctively stepping back. His heartbeat quickened as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The boy didn't blink, just stared at him with those empty, hollow eyes as if waiting for something. The child didn't move. He just looked at Mark, his small form rocking back and forth. A sharp gust of wind swept through the bus stop, rustling the boy's hair, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw something in the shadows behind the child. A shape, a dark silhouette, something that didn't belong, but when he blinked it was gone. The boy's lips parted slightly, but instead of speaking, a soft giggle escaped his mouth, high-pitched and almost playful, but somehow wrong. It wasn't a child's laugh. It was hollow, empty, like it came from somewhere far, far away. "I'm just waiting for the bus," the boy muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's almost here. You'll see." Mark stared, his mouth dry, his mind spinning. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and all at once, the world around him seemed to shift, as though the town had become too quiet, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. The boy's words echoed in Mark's mind. "It's almost here. You'll see." Mark swallowed hard, feeling a sudden, desperate urge to leave. This wasn't right. The child, his eyes, the way the air had thickened, everything about this was wrong. Mark took a cautious step back, his legs stiff as though they were made of stone. He turned to leave, but just as he did, he heard the boy's voice again. "Don't go." Mark froze, every muscle in his body tense. His head snapped back toward the boy, but the child had already turned his head, looking at the dark street beyond the bus stop as though he hadn't said anything at all. The child's voice, soft and strange, repeated in Mark's mind. "Don't go." Mark didn't wait for another second. He turned on his heel, walking briskly, then breaking into a run. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and his mind raced with confusion and fear. What had just happened? What was that? He could feel the boy's presence lingering in the air, as if he were being watched, followed. Mark glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the child standing at the bus stop, still watching, still waiting. But there was nothing. Just the empty street and the glowing streetlights casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. He reached his apartment building, his heart still racing, and hurried inside, slamming the door behind him. He locked it without thinking, his hands shaking. As he stood in the hallway trying to catch his breath, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's eyes. Black, empty, watching him. Mark leaned against the door, trying to steady his breath, but his mind was a whirlwind. Had he just imagined it? Had it all been a product of his overactive imagination? But the feeling, the weight of it, lingered in his chest, suffocating him. As he glanced out the window, the streets of Black Hollow were empty, quiet. But the weight of something unseen pressed on him, a presence he couldn't shake. He pulled the curtains tighter, shut off the lights, and collapsed onto the couch. But even as his eyes closed, as sleep threatened to take over, Mark couldn't escape the nagging thought in the back of his mind. The child at the bus stop had disappeared, But Mark knew deep down that it wasn't over. The presence was still there, lurking in the shadows of Black Hollow, and it was watching him. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The town of Black Hollow had always been quiet, but now the silence seemed oppressive, suffocating even. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And it wasn't just the eerie atmosphere, it was the small, unsettling details that had started to gnaw at him. First, the strange kids, then the cryptic warnings from Pat. Now it was something else, something unexplainable. Later that evening, Mark found himself walking toward the bus stop again. He had hoped to catch a late ride to clear his mind after a long day of writing and research, but the words Pat had shared kept replaying in his mind. The tag-along kids, the things that follow people. He couldn't shake the thought that it was more than just local legends. Something about this town, about these events, felt too real. As he approached the bus stop, the air seemed to grow colder. It wasn't a dramatic drop in temperature, but just enough to make him feel uneasy. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, rubbing his hands together to keep warm. Despite it being a mild evening, a chill settled on him and he couldn't explain why. The bus stop was empty. The usual lingering figures, a few scattered commuters or people waiting for late-night rides, were gone. The street lights, the dull buzz of their flickering, were the only sounds. Mark glanced up at the nearest light, a sickly yellow hue casting a ghostly glow over the empty stop. It had always flickered before, but tonight something was different. The light buzzed loudly, as if struggling to stay on, then flickered again, this time more violently, as if on the verge of going out. He winced at the noise, the high-pitched hum grating on his nerves. Mark stood there, watching the light, trying to ignore the rising tension in his chest. He checked his watch, 5 minutes until the bus came. He could still make it if he stayed calm. But the light didn't stop flickering. It sputtered, then buzzed again, louder this time, as if the electricity itself were protesting. Mark's eyes darted toward the shadows at the edge of the bus stop where he thought he saw movement, just a flicker in the corner of his vision. He turned his head quickly, but there was nothing there. It's just the light, he thought. You're overthinking things. Relax. But when the light flickered again, the buzzing sound growing more erratic, Mark felt the hair on his neck stand up. It didn't feel like a simple malfunction. There was something unnervingly deliberate about it. The hum seemed almost too intentional. He took a step closer to the light, drawn to the erratic flashing. Each time it flickered, it seemed to come closer to being extinguished. Mark hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing against the light pole. A sharp crackle echoed through the air. The light buzzed loudly once more, then with a loud pop went out entirely. Mark froze. The sudden silence was deafening. It wasn't the usual flicker of a light bulb. It was as if the power itself had been shut off, not by the usual glitches in the town's electrical grid, but by something else. Something unnatural. The light didn't come back on. It remained dead, and the darkness around him deepened. Mark stood still for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the sudden lack of light. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone to check the time. But as his fingers tapped the screen, a strange thing happened. The phone, usually reliable, didn't respond. It remained black, unyielding. He pressed the power button again and again, but the phone remained off. "Come on," Mark muttered to himself, frustration bubbling up. He pressed the button repeatedly, but it didn't turn on. He could feel the rising sense of dread pooling in his stomach. His phone had been at half battery when he checked it earlier, so it shouldn't have been dead. A strange feeling washed over him. The cold had deepened, and the stillness in the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. Mark glanced at the bus stop, where the faint glow of the streetlights barely illuminated the darkness beyond. He could hear the distant murmur of the wind rustling through the trees, but nothing else. No cars, no people, no sounds at all. The town seemed utterly deserted. Suddenly, Mark felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like something was watching him. He turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the street was still empty. His heart began to beat faster, his pulse quickening. It was too quiet, too still. He shoved his phone back in his pocket and began to walk briskly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an urgent need to leave. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that wasn't visible but was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for him to notice. As he reached the end of the block, the wind picked up, and Mark couldn't help but look over his shoulder once more. The bus stop was behind him now, but he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Something about the dead light, the strange malfunction of his phone, the stillness of the town, it all added up to something far darker than he was willing to admit. He stopped for a moment, forcing himself to take a deep breath. "Just a glitch," he muttered under his breath. "Just a coincidence." But even as the words left his mouth, he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was more to it, more than just a busted streetlight or a dying phone. There was something in Black Hollow, something that had been lurking, waiting, just out of sight. And now, for the first time, Mark was starting to see it. As he walked home, the wind howled again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just the usual chill of evening air. It was as if the wind carried with it something else, something old, something that had been there long before Mark had arrived. He quickened his pace. When he reached his apartment, he didn't hesitate. He locked the door behind him, checked the windows, and pulled the curtains closed, as if sealing out whatever it was that had been following him. But despite the safety of his apartment, the dread that had taken root in his chest refused to leave. Something was wrong in Black Hollow, and Mark could feel it, truly feel it for the first time. Something had been watching him, and it was getting closer. It had been a few days since the strange incident at the bus stop, but the unease that had settled deep in Mark's gut hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had grown stronger, more persistent, like a shadow that clung to him no matter where he went. He couldn't stop thinking about the flickering light, the dead phone, and the way everything in Black Hollow seemed to be just a little off. The strange feeling of being watched lingered even in the safety of his apartment. It was as if the town itself was whispering secrets just out of reach, teasing him with things he didn't yet understand. That evening, Mark had decided to take a walk to clear his head. He hadn't been able to focus on his work. His mind kept wandering back to the kids, the cryptic warnings, and the strange events that seemed to have no explanation. Black Hollow was the kind of place where stories festered, growing larger in the telling, and Mark had always prided himself on being a skeptic. But now he wasn't so sure. The evening air was crisp, and the streets were quiet, as they often were in Black Hollow after dark. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement, and the only sound was the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Mark walked aimlessly, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that had become a constant companion. The town seemed so peaceful at first glance, but the more time he spent here, the more it felt like there was something lurking beneath the surface, a darkness that wasn't quite visible but was undeniably there. As he turned down a side street, Mark felt it again, the prickle at the back of his neck, the sensation that he wasn't alone. He paused, scanning the shadows that stretched along the walls of the buildings. The alley ahead was narrow and barely illuminated by the weak glow of the street lights. It was the kind of place he would normally avoid, but some compulsion pulled him toward it. Just as he stepped forward, he caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the far end of the alley, was the child, the same one from the bus stop, the same unsettling, unblinking stare, the same small, fragile figure cloaked in the darkness of the alley. The child was standing perfectly still, watching him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The child was alone again, no one else in sight. But this time there was something more, something different. A sense of familiarity, but also a sense of impending danger. The boy didn't speak at first. He just watched Mark, his eyes fixed on him with that same eerie emptiness. Mark felt a coldness creeping up his spine, the hairs on his neck rising in response to the boy's unblinking gaze. He wanted to turn away to leave, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. "Why are you always watching me?" Mark finally blurted, his voice cracking slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. The child's lips parted, but instead of answering directly, he simply said, "I'm here to protect you." Mark furrowed his brow. "Protect me from what?" The boy's gaze shifted, and for the first time Mark saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost human, almost vulnerable. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "From them," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark took a cautious step forward, his mind racing. "From who? Who are you talking about?" The child's expression remained unchanged, but there was a shift in the air, a tension that Mark couldn't quite place. The wind picked up, swirling around them in the alley, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker. It was as if the very space around them had changed, become more oppressive, more suffocating. "They follow," the boy said simply, his voice almost a monotone. "They're always watching, always waiting." Mark's confusion deepened. "Who? What are you talking about? Who is following me?" The child didn't answer. He merely rocked slightly back and forth as though he were waiting for something, waiting for Mark to understand. But what was there to understand? Mark's heart began to race, his pulse quickening with an almost primal sense of fear. The boy's words were cryptic, nonsensical, and yet there was a cold, undeniable truth to them. "Why me?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you following me?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, his gaze flickered to the shadows behind Mark as if something was approaching, something he didn't want to acknowledge openly. His eyes, those pitch-black eyes, grew wider, almost frantic. "They can hear," the boy said urgently, his voice rising. "They're coming." Mark whipped his head around, his heart pounding in his chest. The alley behind him was empty, as it had been moments before. But the chill in the air had deepened, and the oppressive silence seemed to press in around him. Before Mark could say another word, the child turned abruptly, his small form disappearing into the darkness of the alley with unnatural speed. "Wait!" Mark called, taking a step forward, but it was too late. The child had vanished without a sound, as if he had melted into the shadows. Mark stood frozen, his mind racing. What had just happened? What had the child meant? Who was he? Why had he said he was there to protect Mark? And from what? His heart still pounding, Mark took a step back, feeling the weight of the silence press down on him once more. The shadows around him seemed to close in, and he quickly turned, his feet carrying him away from the alley, away from the unsettling encounter. But as he walked away, his mind couldn't stop racing. The child had disappeared again, just like before. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in Black Hollow. The boy had said he was protecting him, but from what? And if the child was right, if there was something following him, then why hadn't he felt it before? Why now? The sense of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger as Mark hurried home, his footsteps echoing in the empty street. The city seemed even quieter than usual, the oppressive silence hanging over everything. Mark could almost hear his own heartbeat, loud and thunderous in his ears. He had hoped the town's strange events would fade, that they were nothing more than figments of his imagination, but now there was no escaping it. He wasn't just seeing strange things, he was feeling them, and whatever was following him, whatever it was, had just made its presence known once again. Mark quickened his pace, the weight of the boy's cryptic warning pressing down on him. They follow. Mark had no idea what that meant, but for the first time since coming to Black Hollow, he was starting to understand that whatever was lurking in the shadows was far darker than he had ever imagined. Mark's apartment was quieter than usual that evening. The city outside seemed to be holding its breath, the usual sounds of traffic and distant voices muted, as though the world had suddenly fallen into a deep, unsettling silence. He sat at his small dining table, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, but it didn't feel cozy. Instead, it felt isolating, like the walls were closing in on him, and the shadows were creeping toward him in the corners. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself. It was early fall, but the temperature had been mild, at least inside his apartment. Tonight, though, the chill was different. It wasn't just the usual evening coolness. It felt as if the air itself had turned colder. The warmth of the room seemed to be slipping away, slowly, like someone had turned down the thermostat without him noticing. He stood up and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly, just enough to peer outside. The streets of Black Hollow were as silent as ever, with the occasional car passing by far off in the distance. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the trees outside, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Yet the cold persisted, seeping into his skin, wrapping around his bones. He glanced back at his phone, checking the time. It was just after midnight, but he couldn't shake the restlessness gnawing at him. He hadn't been able to sleep properly for the past few nights, not since the encounter with the boy in the alley. The boy's words still echoed in his mind like a broken record. They follow. Who were they? What did the boy mean by that? And why was he suddenly feeling more and more like a stranger in his own skin? Suddenly, a giggle, soft and high-pitched, floated through the air, an odd, unsettling sound that didn't belong in the quiet night. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a child's laugh, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was light, almost playful, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He stood absolutely still, straining his ears, waiting for the laugh to come again, but the silence swallowed it up. There was no one outside the window, no children, no figures in the street, just darkness. Mark's pulse quickened. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a distant sound carried on the wind, perhaps, or just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the laughter had felt wrong, like it had come from somewhere deep inside the shadows, just out of reach. It wasn't the kind of laugh he was used to hearing. It wasn't innocent, it was malicious, unsettling. He turned away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. The room felt colder now, colder than before. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and walked toward the hallway, trying to shake off the anxiety that was growing inside him. As he passed by the small kitchen, he paused. There, through the narrow opening in the wall, he could see the hallway leading to the bathroom. And there at the far end, just beyond the sliver of light spilling out from under his bedroom door, he saw someone. A figure, small and shadowed, standing in the hallway. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he blinked. The figure was gone, disappeared. His pulse raced, his breath shallow. Had he imagined it? He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but when he looked again, the hallway was empty. Was it the stress? Was it exhaustion playing tricks on his mind? Maybe he just thought he saw something. He stepped back into the living room, telling himself to calm down, to rationalize. But as he tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, he noticed something else. The apartment, which had once felt familiar, now felt alien. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavier, like it was pressing on him. The hum of the city, normally faint but ever-present, was gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. No distant traffic, no voices from outside, just stillness. Mark took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. This wasn't like him. He was a reporter, a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghost stories or town legends, but the feeling, the way everything felt wrong now, like the entire town had become a stage for something sinister. He couldn't deny it anymore. He glanced out the window again. This time, he thought he saw movement in the alley below. It was brief, just a flicker of motion, but enough to make his heart race. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he stared into the darkness. There, near the far corner of the alley, a shadow moved. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the pool of light cast by the street lamp. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. His fingers were numb, his mind spinning as he unlocked the screen. But when he looked down, the screen remained black. His phone was dead again, completely unresponsive. His heart sank and an icy chill crept up his spine. The figure in the alley didn't move, but Mark could feel its presence. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it watching him, waiting for something. He swallowed hard, fighting the rising tide of panic in his chest. He tried to rationalize, to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the cold that had settled over him wasn't something he could dismiss. The figure outside, the silence inside, the strange giggle, something was wrong. Something had changed in Black Hollow, and it was getting closer. Mark turned away from the window, his hands shaking as he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. He couldn't stay here, not with the growing sense of dread, not with the constant feeling that something was lurking just beyond his reach. He walked quickly to the door, his breath shallow, his chest tight. As he reached for the handle, he heard it again, the laugh. This time closer, right behind him. He spun around, his heart thundering in his chest, but the apartment was empty. The door was still locked. The shadows in the corners remained motionless. Yet somehow he knew he wasn't alone. And just as quickly as the sensation had hit, it was gone. The chill faded, the eerie silence lifted, and Mark was left standing in his apartment, alone, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The laughter lingered in his ears, but when he looked around, there was nothing to explain it. Nothing but the oppressive silence of Black Hollow creeping in, surrounding him. For the first time since coming to this town, Mark was certain of one thing. He had crossed into something he didn't understand. Something was in Black Hollow, and it was watching him. The evening was thick with tension when Mark received a knock on his apartment door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and given the events of the past few days, he had grown increasingly reclusive. But when he peered through the peephole, he saw Pat standing outside, his features shadowed by the dim light from the hallway. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Pat's expression was unreadable as he stood there, shifting from foot to foot, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an air of unease. Mark hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. "Hey," Mark said, forcing a casual tone despite the anxiety bubbling inside him. "What's up?" Pat stepped inside quickly as if he didn't want to linger in the hallway for too long. He didn't make eye contact immediately, his gaze dropping to the floor as he brushed past Mark. "Can we talk? It's important." Mark closed the door behind him, locking it instinctively, as if Pat's visit alone had somehow amplified the tension in the apartment. "Sure, what's going on?" He was eager to hear what Pat had to say, but a part of him already knew, somehow, this conversation wouldn't be like the others. There was something different in Pat's posture, something guarded, as if he were holding back something he didn't want to admit. Pat didn't respond right away. He stood in the middle of the living room, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. Mark waited, feeling the silence stretch between them like an unseen force. Finally, Pat spoke. "You were right to be concerned about the kids and about everything that's happening here." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a weight to it that immediately made Mark's chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, though a sickening feeling had already begun to settle in his gut. Pat looked up, his eyes darkened with something Mark had never seen before: fear. "I didn't want to believe it at first. When I came to Black Hollow, I thought the stories about the tag-along kids were just that, stories. Urban legends, the kind of thing people tell to spook newcomers, but I was wrong." Mark's mind raced. The words "tag-along kids" echoed in his ears like a haunting refrain. The chill in his apartment seemed to intensify, as if the very air around him was becoming heavier. He sat down on the couch, his heart pounding in his chest. "What happened to you, Pat? What did you see?" Pat let out a long sigh, as if the weight of the memories was a physical burden. "It was a couple of years ago when I first started working here. I was covering a story about a local fundraiser, but I kept hearing the whispers. The same stories you've heard about the kids, how they follow people home at night, how they don't belong, how they just wait for something." Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd heard those same stories, but they had always seemed so distant, so detached from reality. Now, with Pat's words, the stories were beginning to take on a new, horrifying weight. Pat continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was just paranoia at first. I'd heard the giggles too, seen the shadows at the bus stops. But one night I was walking home from the bar and I noticed something. A kid, one of them, standing at the end of the street, staring at me. I don't know how long it had been there, but I remember feeling like it was waiting, watching. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, so I kept walking." Mark's breath was shallow now as Pat's story began to blur with the strange encounters he had experienced himself. The giggles, the eyes, the feeling of being followed, the waiting. "Did it follow you?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Pat nodded grimly. "Yeah, I didn't think much of it at first. But when I turned the corner, there it was again. A kid, standing just behind me, not even 5 feet away. I could hear its breathing. The footsteps were too light to make any noise, but I knew, I felt it, it was following me." Mark's stomach twisted into a knot. "But it was just a kid, right? Just..." Pat cut him off sharply. "No, it wasn't just a kid. It wasn't alive, Mark. I've seen enough to know when something's off, and this wasn't right. The eyes, Mark. The eyes were black, solid, no white, no iris, just black, empty. And when it looked at me..." He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. "I swear it was like it knew me, like it knew everything about me. It didn't say a word, but I could hear it in my head, Mark. It told me it was following me, that it was waiting." Mark could feel the blood drain from his face. His heart pounded louder now, the words swirling in his mind. It wasn't alive. It wasn't right. The memories of his own encounters, the strange child at the bus stop, the flickering streetlights, the feeling of being watched, flashed before his eyes. "Pat, what did you do?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. His skepticism, the wall he had built around the logical explanation, was crumbling. "I didn't know what to do," Pat replied, his voice shaky now. "I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but the more I ignored it, the worse it got. They just kept following me. Every night, everywhere I went. At first, it was just one or two of them, but then it was more. It was like they multiplied, Mark. I couldn't go anywhere without seeing them, without feeling their eyes on me." Mark's head swam as he processed what Pat was saying. His instincts, which had once told him to laugh off the stories, now screamed at him to listen. Pat's words were no longer just a warning. They were a confirmation of everything Mark had been afraid to admit. There was something real happening in Black Hollow. "The worst part," Pat continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "is that I could never get rid of them. They just waited. I thought if I left, if I moved away, I'd escape, but it didn't work. They followed me wherever I went." Mark's heart clenched as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The tags, the signs, the warnings. Everything Pat was describing matched his own experience. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked. The inexplicable coldness, the flickering lights, the shadowy figures at the bus stops. It was all connected, all leading to one horrifying conclusion. "They followed you home," Mark whispered, more to himself than to Pat. Pat nodded, his face drawn with a deep, haunted expression. "They're still out there, Mark, watching, waiting. And if you're not careful, you'll end up like me, trapped. You can't escape them. They want something. I don't know what, but whatever it is, it's not good." Mark's mind raced as he pieced together the threads of the horror he had been witnessing. Pat's words, chilling as they were, had shattered the final barrier of disbelief in Mark's mind. There was something supernatural at play in Black Hollow, something far darker than he had ever imagined. Mark sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of Pat's warning settle on him like a heavy shroud. His skin felt cold, the air around him suddenly thick with dread. "And the kids?" Mark asked, his voice hollow. "They're not kids, Mark," Pat replied quietly, "and they won't stop until they get what they want." Mark's heart sank as he realized the truth. He wasn't just in a town with strange stories. He was in real danger. And whatever was following him, whatever had been stalking the town for years, was closing in on him too. It started subtly, like the flicker of a streetlight that you might dismiss as a power surge or faulty wiring. But after a few days, Mark couldn't ignore it anymore. Everywhere he went, it felt as though the town itself was watching him. The lights, once a benign part of his daily routine, now seemed to flicker in time with his footsteps, like they were responding to his presence. They weren't just malfunctioning. It was as if they were waiting for him to pass, dimming and buzzing just as he came near, flickering out when he walked away. He tried to laugh it off, tried to tell himself that it was just the town's infrastructure finally showing its age, but the eerie pattern was undeniable. He had started walking faster, almost in a hurry, his eyes constantly darting from one street lamp to the next, anticipating the flicker. And it wasn't just the lights. He began to see the children more frequently. At first, it was just the occasional glimpse, just out of the corner of his eye, fleeting like shadows. But soon they seemed to be everywhere, standing in alleyways, lurking at bus stops, always watching. They weren't just figures anymore, they were watchers. The same ones he had seen before, their hollow black eyes boring into him from the edges of his vision. Mark tried to tell himself it was his paranoia, his fear eating away at his logic, but the presence was so tangible, so real that he couldn't escape it. One night, as Mark hurried down an empty street, the familiar hum of the city grew silent. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and heavy, pressing against his skin like an unseen weight. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each step amplifying the growing tension in his chest. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that it was just the strange quiet of the late hour, but his heart was pounding, his mind racing. As he passed under a streetlight, it flickered, just as it always did now when he walked by. He kept walking, forcing himself to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was intensifying. He could feel it like a heavy hand on his back, cold and pressing. He quickened his pace, hoping to outrun it, but his feet felt heavier with each step. Then, just as he reached the corner, he saw them, two children standing in the shadows of a nearby alley. Their faces were hidden in darkness, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. The unmistakable chill ran down his spine as his pulse quickened. There was no sound, no movement, just those two figures standing completely still. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move. The more he stared at them, the more the world around him seemed to blur, as if the alleyway had grown larger, darker, and more suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, a dull thud that drowned out everything else. The silence was broken by a voice, soft, childlike, but laced with something that made Mark's skin crawl. "They're coming," the voice whispered from the shadows. Mark spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no one behind him, nothing but empty streets stretching into the darkness. His breath was shallow, his hands trembling. The voice had come from nowhere, but it had been so clear, so real. It wasn't his imagination. He knew that now. He wasn't just hearing things. Something was here. Something was following him. The kids in the alley didn't move. They didn't speak again. They just stood there, waiting, watching. Mark could feel their eyes burning into him, but when he tried to focus on their faces, they were gone, vanished into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. A rush of cold air swept past him, causing his skin to prickle. The temperature had dropped significantly, as if the very night itself had turned against him. Mark's body screamed at him to move, to get away, but his legs felt frozen, unwilling to obey. It was like something was holding him in place, like something was drawing him in. He took a step backward, then another. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The fear had begun to consume him, wrapping around his heart like a vice, squeezing tighter with every step he took. He could feel it now, the weight of eyes on him, the sense that he was never truly alone. The laughter of the children echoed faintly in his ears, as if it was coming from the corners of his mind, from the spaces between his thoughts. As he turned a corner, he glanced over his shoulder again. The alley was empty. No children, no shadows, just the same cold, empty street. But the air around him still felt wrong. The quiet that had followed him felt suffocating now, oppressive. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had followed him, that the eyes of those children were still watching him, even though he couldn't see them. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him, breathing heavily. He leaned against it, his head spinning. The world outside felt too vast, too empty, and the walls of his apartment, his supposed sanctuary, felt like they were closing in. His phone was dead again, the screen unresponsive when he tried to turn it on. It had been fine earlier that day, but now it was useless. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the more he sat there, the more he realized that it wasn't just the kids. It wasn't just the strange flickering lights or the weird coincidences. It was the presence, that feeling of being followed, of being watched, that he couldn't ignore any longer. The town of Black Hollow was no longer just a quiet, forgotten place. It was something darker, something alive. The weight of its history, of the legends that had long been dismissed, was beginning to settle on Mark's shoulders, and the fear was starting to consume him. Every flicker of light, every shadow, every strange giggle, they were all parts of something bigger, something darker that Mark was only beginning to understand. And it was getting closer. Mark had always prided himself on his skepticism. He was a reporter, a man of logic, facts, and reason. But with every passing day in Black Hollow, reality seemed to shift further away from what he could explain. That night, things escalated. It started simply, as most unsettling events do. Mark had just settled into his apartment, the silence thick around him. He was sitting on the couch, idly scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself from the weight of the day. The city outside seemed even quieter than usual. The soft hum of the streetlights, the only noise that had kept the darkness at bay, had stopped. It was as if the world had gone still, as if time itself was holding its breath. Mark wasn't sure what time it was when it first happened, but suddenly the soft click of a light switch echoed from across the room. He froze, his phone slipping from his hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The lamp on the far end of the room had turned on, bathing the room in a sudden, harsh glow. He blinked in confusion, glancing around. He was sure he had turned the lamp off earlier when he'd sat down. Mark's mind raced for an explanation. Maybe I bumped the switch, he thought. He got up to turn it off, but just as he reached the light, it flickered violently. The bulb buzzed loudly, and then, just like that, it went out. Mark stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty space where the light had been. His heart was pounding, but he told himself it was nothing. Faulty wiring, he rationalized. Old building, but deep down he knew better. He tried to ignore the sense of dread settling in his chest as he moved back to the couch. Just as he sat down, the lights in the hallway flickered, then the kitchen light buzzed to life, then shut off, flickering again. It was as if the entire apartment was alive, shifting, adjusting, responding to something Mark couldn't see. Suddenly, a soft giggle echoed from the darkness beyond the living room. Mark's blood ran cold. It wasn't a laugh that could be explained away by a passing car or a sound from the street. It was too close, too real, too wrong. He jumped up, his eyes darting around the apartment. The sound of the giggling, light and playful, seemed to come from all around him. It wasn't a child's laugh, it was something else, something that made the hairs on his neck rise, something that made the air feel thick, like it was suffocating him. "Hello," Mark called, his voice wavering as he scanned the dark corners of the room. "Is someone here?" No response. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence that seemed to press against him, thickening the air in the room. Mark took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't imagining it. He knew that now. Something was here, something beyond his understanding. The quiet hum of the city, the normal sounds of his apartment had all disappeared, leaving him with the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. He turned quickly, heading for the kitchen to grab his phone. But as he crossed the living room, his foot caught on something. He stumbled and nearly fell, but caught himself. He looked down to see a small object, a book, lying in the middle of the floor. It hadn't been there before. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The book. It had been on the shelf. He was sure of it. Without thinking, he rushed back to the kitchen, desperate for a sense of normalcy, something tangible he could hold onto. He grabbed his phone again, but the screen remained black. His heart sank. The phone was dead again. He had charged it just earlier that day. He pressed the power button several times, but it remained unresponsive. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his wrist. Mark gasped in shock and turned to see what had caused the pain. His skin was burning. Not just a simple ache or discomfort, but a sharp, intense heat, as if someone had pressed a hot iron to his wrist. He looked down and saw a dark, red mark beginning to form on his skin, a clear, raised line. It was as if something or someone had just branded him. He staggered back in horror, instinctively clutching his wrist. The pain intensified for a moment, then slowly began to fade, but the mark remained, dark and unsettling, as if something had left its imprint on him. Mark's mind raced. What the hell was happening? First the lights, then the giggle, and now this. His wrist was burning and his phone was dead, and the apartment felt alive. It was as though the very air around him was charged with something he couldn't explain. The silence had returned, thick and suffocating. The oppressive weight of the room seemed to close in on him. He could still hear the faint echoes of the giggling, distant now but unmistakably there. Panic began to rise within him. Was this real? Was he losing his mind? He couldn't escape the feeling that something was in the room with him, something that had crossed over into his apartment, something that was trying to make its presence known, force its way in. The apartment wasn't just a place anymore. It felt like a prison, a place where unseen forces lurked, watching, waiting. Mark could feel the air grow colder, and the weight of those unseen eyes pressing down on him. His wrist still burned, the mark now a dark, ugly thing on his skin. The room around him seemed to shift, its shadows growing longer, deeper. He glanced towards the hallway and saw a flicker, a shadow passing just beyond the doorway. For a second he thought he saw a figure standing there, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. Mark stumbled backward, his breath shallow, his chest tight. He wanted to scream, to call someone, to do anything to break this awful feeling. But his voice caught in his throat. It was as if something was suffocating him from the inside out, a pressure that made it hard to think clearly. He turned quickly, heading for the door. But before he could reach it, the lights in the living room flickered again, this time with an unnatural intensity. The overhead light buzzed loudly, flickering wildly as if it were going to explode. The air crackled with an energy he couldn't explain. And then it happened again. The giggling. It was louder this time, more insistent, more malevolent. It seemed to come from every direction, echoing in his mind. Mark's head spun, his vision blurred, and he felt the walls close in around him. The lights flickered once more, and just as quickly everything went black. For a moment there was nothing but the suffocating darkness and the oppressive silence. But as Mark's breath quickened, he felt something stir. The presence was back. It was right behind him. The air in Mark's apartment had never felt heavier. The walls seemed to close in around him, pressing in from all sides. He hadn't been able to shake the events of the past few days. The flickering lights, the strange giggles in the dark, the eerie feeling of being watched. And now the mark on his wrist, the sharp pain that had burned into his skin like some twisted brand, was still there. Every time he glanced at it, it seemed to pulse, as if the darkness itself had left its imprint on him. Mark sat on his couch, staring at the walls, unable to focus on anything but the pounding in his head. He had tried to rationalize it. He had tried to tell himself that there had to be an explanation, some logical reason for all of this. But with every passing hour, every new unexplained event, it became harder to hold onto that belief. His skepticism was cracking. His mind was unraveling. And then, as if on cue, the phone rang. Mark jumped startled, the sound of the phone's ring slicing through the oppressive silence. His hand trembled as he reached for it, heart racing in his chest. "Mark!" It was Pat's voice, familiar but strained. "Listen to me. I don't have much time. Whatever you do, do not open the door for anyone, especially not the kids. You understand?" Mark's breath caught in his throat and the chill that had settled on his skin deepened. "What do you mean, Pat? What's going on?" Pat's voice lowered, laced with fear. "I've seen what happens. I've seen it before. There was a colleague of mine. He was just like you, skeptical, curious, thinking he could handle it. He got too close, started to investigate too much. And one night they knocked on his door just like they did to you. It was them, the tag-along kids. Only he didn't recognize them at first. They wore the faces of people he knew, friends, family. They spoke in voices he trusted, but something was off. I don't know how he could have missed it, but he did. He opened the door and he was never seen again." Mark stood frozen, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. "What happened to him?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Pat sighed deeply. "I don't know. We all assumed he was dead, but we couldn't prove it. We never found his body, just the empty apartment. And the air around it, Mark, it smelled wrong. You have to understand, they're not just kids. They're something else. And once they get inside, once you let them in, it's over. You don't get out." Mark's throat went dry as the weight of Pat's warning pressed down on him. He had already felt the oppressive presence in his apartment, the growing sense of being stalked. But now, hearing Pat's words, so desperate, so full of regret, Mark realized the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. He wasn't just dealing with strange coincidences. There was something sinister at play in Black Hollow, something that didn't follow the rules of the world Mark knew. "Don't open the door for anyone, Mark. Not even if it's me. Not unless you hear the password." Mark's pulse quickened. "Password," he repeated, confusion settling in. "Yeah," Pat's voice lowered to a near whisper. "It's the only way to know if it's really me. If they come, if you hear a knock, ask for the password. If they don't know it, it's not me. If they do, you open the door, but only if it's me." Mark could feel the weight of those words sink in. The entire town, the entire world he had known, was being turned upside down. His eyes darted to the door, the silence in his apartment growing heavier with every passing second. What if someone knocked? What if they came for him just as Pat had warned? "I'll be there soon." Pat's voice cut through his thoughts, his tone sharper now. "Just stay inside. Don't let them in, Mark. Not unless you're sure." The line went dead before Mark could say anything more. The phone fell from his hand, landing on the couch with a dull thud. His mind was spinning. He couldn't breathe. The idea of them, the tag-along kids, the entities that weren't children at all, was too much to grasp. But Pat had made it clear, whatever was going on, whatever these things were, they were real, and they were coming for him. Just as the thought settled into his mind, there was a knock at the door. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat and his pulse roared in his ears. For a moment, he couldn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door as if it were an impenetrable barrier between him and whatever waited on the other side. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Mark's mind raced. It had to be them. It had to be. He backed away slowly from the door, his legs feeling like they were made of stone. His eyes darted around the apartment as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, its rhythm an ominous reminder of the time slipping away. There was another knock, soft, Repeating the same pattern as before, Mark froze. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. He knew he should ask for the password, he knew he had to, but the fear gnawed at him, the instinct to just open the door and get it over with. But Pat's warning echoed in his mind. Don't open the door for anyone, not unless you hear the password. The password. Mark's hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but he stopped himself, taking a deep breath. He had to do this right. He had to be sure. He approached the door cautiously, feeling every second stretch longer than the last. The silence that followed the knock was suffocating. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, and for a brief moment his mind flashed with images of the strange kids he had seen lurking in the shadows, the figure he had seen in the alley, the way they followed, the way they knew things no one else could. Mark swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper as he called out to the person on the other side of the door. "Who is it?" There was a pause, a breath. Then the voice came low and familiar. "It's me, Mark. Open up, I'm here to help." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice instantly. But then a sudden chill ran down his spine as the words he had been warned about played over and over in his mind, the password. Without thinking, Mark's voice cracked as he asked, "What's the password?" There was a long silence on the other side of the door. Then the voice came again, this time tinged with a strange, almost mocking tone. "Banana Tuesday." Mark's blood ran cold. That wasn't the password. It was wrong. It wasn't Pat. His hand flew to the deadbolt, his body moving instinctively. But just as his fingers touched it, the door suddenly shuddered as if something was pressing against it from the other side. And then the laughter, that same high-pitched, eerie giggle echoing from the dark. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. The thing on the other side of the door was not Pat, and it was not human. Mark staggered backward, his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath quick and shallow. The laughter rose, filling the apartment, and for the first time he understood. The real danger had arrived. And it wasn't knocking. The silence in Mark's apartment was deafening. Every second felt like an eternity as the echoes of the eerie laughter filled his ears. His mind was spinning. Banana Tuesday. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't Pat. The voice on the other side of the door, it wasn't him. And now, with his back pressed to the wall, Mark realized that the terror he had only barely understood was here in full force. The presence that had been stalking him, that had haunted every step he took in Black Hollow, was now standing right outside his door. The room around him felt like it was closing in. The shadows deepened, curling like tendrils that reached out from every corner, threatening to engulf him. He tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if it were suffocating him. The coldness from before, the unnatural, bone-chilling coldness, was back, wrapping itself around his body like an iron grip. His fingers trembled as they reached for his phone once again, but it was dead, unresponsive as always. His heart pounded in his chest and his thoughts raced. "What is it?" he thought. "What are they?" He thought of Pat's warning, "They're not kids, they're not human," but that only left him with more questions. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they latched onto him? There was another knock, louder this time, more forceful. The door trembled under the pressure as if something or someone was pushing against it with relentless force. Mark's mind snapped back into focus. He had to act. He had to survive. But how? A sudden thought surged through him, cutting through the fear, the password. Pat had given him the key. If the entity outside didn't know the password, it wasn't Pat. That meant it was something else, something pretending to be him, pretending to be someone he could trust. Mark's pulse raced as he glanced around his apartment, looking for something, anything, that could help. His eyes locked onto the old baseball bat he'd kept from last summer's league. It was a ridiculous thought, but it was the only thing within arm's reach. He grabbed it, feeling its weight, the smooth wood pressing into his palm. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Then, just as he was about to back away from the door, a soft whisper floated through the air. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A child's voice, too calm, too smooth. "You can't run, Mark. You can't escape." Mark's breath caught in his throat, and a chill ran through him. The voice sounded so close, yet the apartment was empty. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the room, from somewhere near him, but there was no one there. A sharp crack of wood splitting the silence made him spin around. The light flickered above him, dimming before going out entirely. The temperature plummeted and Mark's breath fogged in the air. He looked up, and there, in the corner of the room, standing at the threshold between darkness and light, was a figure, a child. It was the same child. The one he had seen on the streets, the one whose eyes were nothing but endless black voids, but now it was closer. It was standing in the room with him, silent, watching. The child didn't move, but Mark could feel its presence as if it were a physical weight pressing against him. He could feel its gaze, cold and consuming, seeping into his bones. It spoke again, this time its voice far too clear, far too close, as if it were in his head. "You don't understand, Mark. We're already here." The words chilled him to the core. They weren't just following him. They were here in his apartment, in his mind. He could feel them creeping through the air, crawling under his skin. He swung the bat wildly at the empty air, but it was like hitting smoke. There was nothing to strike. The child stood there, unwavering, like a shadow that would not be dismissed. "You're not real," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse, filled with panic, but the child didn't react. It just stood there, silent and still. But then something changed. The child tilted its head slightly, its empty black eyes locking onto Mark with an intensity that made his knees go weak. Mark's heart pounded as the shadows around him deepened, swirling like a storm. The air grew heavier, colder, until it felt like the very walls were pressing in on him. Mark's grip on the bat tightened. His mind raced, desperate for any solution. Think, he thought. There's a way out, there has to be, and then it hit him. Pat's words echoed in his head. They're not kids, they're something else, something older, something ancient. The figure in front of him was not a child, not truly. It was a mask, an illusion, a shadow that had taken on the appearance of a child, a trap, and it wasn't just one. There were more of them waiting, watching. Mark's eyes darted around, and as the shadows closed in, he felt a sudden surge of understanding. The thing he was facing wasn't just a creature, it was multiple. There were more. The figure before him wasn't alone. He wasn't facing just one child. He was facing an entire group, an army of these unnatural beings that had followed him home. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. He wasn't just a target, he was the prey. And they had been hunting him for days, slowly wearing him down with fear, with isolation. Now they had come to claim him. Mark backed away from the child, his heart racing, his breath shallow. "What do you want?" he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. The child tilted its head again. "You are what we want, Mark." It was then that Mark understood. The tag-along kids weren't after his life, they were after his soul. They were after his very being, his fear, his energy, everything that made him human. They fed on it, they thrived on it. Before he could react, the shadows in the room surged forward, like a tidal wave of darkness crashing toward him, enveloping him. He swung the bat again, but it passed right through the darkness like it wasn't even there. And then something in the air shifted, a sudden, violent presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Mark's vision blurred, his breath shallow, as a cold, invisible hand reached out to grasp his chest. The pressure on his lungs grew, and for a split second, Mark thought he was going to collapse, to be consumed by the darkness. But then in that moment of pure panic, something broke inside him. The terror, the fear, everything. He let it go, he fought it. With all his strength, Mark yelled. No, the word tore from his throat like a primal scream. He swung the bat one last time, not at the child, not at the shadows, but at the darkness inside himself. The fear, the shadows recoiled. For a moment, everything stopped. Then, with a force he couldn't explain, Mark ran. The door was still locked, but the bat smashed into it, splintering the wood. He didn't stop. He pushed through the fragments, stumbling out into the hallway, into the cold night air. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could feel them behind him. He could feel their eyes, their hunger. But for the first time in days, Mark understood. Survival wasn't about escaping the kids. It was about facing the fear they had planted in his heart. Mark barely made it out alive. He never returned to Black Hollow. The town, with its dark, ancient secrets, had claimed too much of him already. And as he left it all behind, Mark understood the final truth. The only truth he could ever know about the tag-along kids. They didn't need to hunt you down. They only needed to make you believe you were being hunted. And in that, they had already won. The day after Mark's harrowing escape from his apartment, he sat on a bench outside a small coffee shop, staring blankly at the street. His mind was numb, the weight of what had happened slowly starting to settle in. Black Hollow, the town he had come to with curiosity and skepticism, had turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Pat had come to him first thing that morning, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by something more urgent. He told Mark he had a way to help, something that might rid his apartment of the presence that had been haunting him, something to cleanse the darkness that had taken root in the very walls. Pat had insisted they get started right away, not letting Mark protest. Mark wasn't sure what to believe anymore. After everything he had witnessed, the strange giggles, the flickering lights, the physical pain, the terrifying presence of the tag-along kids, he felt like he had been swallowed by something far beyond his comprehension. But Pat was insistent, telling Mark that it was the only way, that it had worked before, that it was the only hope for getting his life back. So now here he was, in a small, dimly lit apartment he had once called home, standing with a priest, Father O'Malley, a man Pat had brought in for the job, who was preparing to perform a cleansing ritual. Mark stood to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, trying to mask the growing fear gnawing at him. Father O'Malley was tall, his black robes flowing as he moved around the apartment, his face solemn yet focused. He had an air of calm authority about him, a practiced ease that put Mark on edge. The priest set up candles in the corners of the room, their flickering flames casting long shadows against the walls. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation. Pat had gone quiet after explaining the process, standing just behind Mark. The skepticism in Mark's eyes hadn't gone unnoticed, but Pat wasn't here to coddle him. He was here to make sure the ritual went smoothly, that Mark's apartment was finally freed of whatever dark force had taken hold of it. Father O'Malley spoke in a low voice as he sprinkled salt in a circle around the room, muttering incantations in Latin. The words were unfamiliar, the cadence strange, but they seemed to reverberate in the air, making the atmosphere hum with energy. Mark couldn't help but shiver as the priest's words grew louder, his movements steady, sure. "This isn't going to work, is it?" Mark whispered to Pat, his voice barely audible. "You can't just cleanse this place, it's already too far gone." Pat looked at him with a sharp, hard gaze. "It has to work. You saw what happened last night, Mark. You felt it. This is your only chance to get it out of here. You can't keep living like this." Mark opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. Pat was right. He couldn't. The fear, the darkness, the way everything in his apartment had started to feel alive. He couldn't keep living like that. He had been running from the truth for days, but now, in the presence of Father O'Malley's calm, focused energy, he could no longer deny it. He needed to believe that this would work. The priest moved to the center of the room where the largest candle was placed. He knelt and began to chant, his voice growing in strength, reverberating off the walls. The flames from the candles flickered wildly, casting odd shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and Mark could feel his skin prickle. He wasn't sure if it was the cold or the strange energy in the air, but a cold sweat began to form on the back of his neck. Pat stood close to him, as if to offer silent reassurance. "It's working," Pat whispered, his gaze never leaving Father O'Malley's movements. Mark felt his heartbeat quicken as the air grew thicker. The words Father O'Malley spoke seemed to fill the room, the vibrations making his teeth rattle. For the first time in days, Mark felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was what he needed. The priest rose, motioning for Mark to step forward. "Come here," he said gently, his voice now steady and calm. "This is where you must take part. We must let the darkness go." Mark hesitated, but he stepped forward, his legs feeling like they were made of stone. Father O'Malley handed him a small vial filled with a strange, dark liquid. "You must anoint your wrist, Mark. The mark you bear is not of this world. We must break its hold." Mark stared at the vial, feeling a wave of dread wash over him. The dark mark on his wrist still burned with an odd, lingering sensation, a constant reminder of what had happened in the past days. He had been branded by something unnatural, something otherworldly. But this cleansing was his chance to reclaim himself, to reclaim his life. He uncorked the vial, and as he dipped his finger into the liquid, a cold chill ran up his arm. The liquid was like ice, but there was something almost comforting about the sensation. As he applied it to the mark, a sharp pain shot through his wrist. For a moment, it felt as though something was trying to hold on to resist the cleansing, but Mark forced himself to keep going. He couldn't let the darkness win. The pain faded almost immediately, replaced by a strange, peaceful warmth spreading from the mark. The oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted, the air feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. Mark stood there, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered it. He looked up at Father O'Malley, who nodded slowly. "It is done," the priest said softly, his voice carrying a note of finality. "The presence has been removed." Mark didn't know what to think. The oppressive weight that had once hung over him was gone. The air felt lighter, and even the light in the room seemed warmer, more natural. The flickering lights had stopped. The coldness was gone. For the first time in days, Mark felt a sense of peace. But as he stood there trying to absorb the relief, a cold shiver crawled down his spine. It wasn't over, not really. Father O'Malley was already moving toward the door, but he paused before leaving, looking back at Mark. "There are things in this world that can't always be defeated by rituals or prayers," he said quietly. "They can be banished, yes, but sometimes they return. Sometimes they wait." Mark frowned, a deep unease settling in his chest. "Wait, for what?" "Until you let them back in," the priest replied cryptically, his gaze steady. "Just remember, Mark, don't let them back in. Never open the door for the wrong ones again." Mark stood frozen, his mouth dry. He nodded slowly, but deep down he knew. The danger wasn't gone. The cleansing had been a temporary measure, a shield against the forces that had tried to consume him. But the darkness was always out there, always waiting for the moment he'd let his guard down again. As Father O'Malley left, Pat turned to Mark with a somber expression. "You're safe now," he said, but there was no joy in his voice. "For now, but don't let your guard down, they always return." Mark watched them both leave, the weight of their words sinking into his chest. He had been freed, but the fear lingered, gnawing at him like an invisible threat. Something had changed. The world wasn't the same anymore, and he wasn't sure if he could ever trust it again. And as he locked the door behind them, Mark glanced back toward the shadows in his apartment. The faintest giggle echoed in the distance. A fleeting sound, but it was enough. He wasn't alone. Not really. The darkness was still out there, and it was waiting. Mark had always thought that after the cleansing, things would return to normal. That once the presence had been banished, the apartment would feel like it used to, safe, familiar, calm. But the truth was, nothing was the same. Not really. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, the unease still clung to him like a second skin, an invisible weight that refused to lift. It had been weeks since Father O'Malley performed the ritual, and yet Mark still couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, something was still there. He had returned to his apartment, determined to move on. The apartment felt quieter, lighter, yes. The oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated him had lifted. The cold, the flickering lights, the sudden, jarring giggles, they were gone. At least they were at first. But now, as the days stretched on, the unease grew. It started with the smallest things, things Mark dismissed at first. A flicker of a light when he passed a hallway. The strange, almost imperceptible chill that would wash over him when he stood too still, like someone was standing just behind him. The giggles, those soft, mocking, high-pitched giggles, seemed to return when the air was stillest, lingering at the edge of his perception like a sound carried on the wind. At night, when the apartment was quiet, he would swear he heard them. It was always the same. Just a whisper, just a fleeting sound, but enough to make his heart race, enough to freeze him in place, waiting, listening. He would turn around, expecting to see the shadows move, expecting to see the children, but there was nothing. Mark stood at the window one evening, staring out at the street, the glow of the city lights stretching into the distance. He had tried to push the fear from his mind, to go on with his life, to let the nightmare of the past few weeks fade into memory, but he couldn't forget it. Every time he stepped outside, every time he passed a dark alley or a bus stop, the fear returned. His eyes darted to every shadow, every figure in the distance, waiting for a glimpse of them, the tag-along kids. The thought of them filled him with dread and disgust. He could feel their eyes on him even when they weren't there. He couldn't shake the images of their black eyes, staring from the dark, unmoving, waiting for something. He had survived once. Yes, but could he survive again? The apartment felt too quiet, too still. He turned away from the window, pacing back toward the living room. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and yet there was something underneath it, something that Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. He had been here before. He had felt this before. That feeling that he wasn't truly alone. That presence. He stopped in the center of the room, breathing deeply, trying to steady himself. He had to face the truth, and the truth was, no matter how many candles Father O'Malley had lit, No matter how many prayers had been spoken, he was still haunted. Haunted by the memory of those black eyes, of the giggles that echoed in the dead of night, of the sensation that something was always lurking in the dark, just out of sight. And then it happened. The light above him flickered, just once but enough to catch his attention. His heart jumped in his chest and he turned quickly, looking up at the bulb. It flickered again, just a brief, sharp blink. Mark froze, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at it for a long moment, waiting for it to do something else, but it didn't. It just hung there, casting its weak glow over the room. He exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the chill running through his spine. It's nothing, he thought, just a faulty bulb, just another small thing. But the doubt crept back in. What if it wasn't just the bulb? What if it was something more? He made his way to the kitchen, hoping to clear his mind. As he opened the fridge, he caught a glimpse of something through the corner of his eye. A shadow, a fleeting silhouette in the doorway. He spun around, his heart thudding, but there was nothing there. Nothing but darkness. Mark stepped closer to the door, his breath shallow. The shadows in the hallway were deep, almost too deep, stretching across the floor like tendrils. The flickering light from the living room illuminated part of the doorway, but the edges of the hallway were swallowed by darkness. The shadows seemed to move. He could feel it again, the same suffocating presence, the same sensation of being watched. A soft giggle, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the hallway. Mark's pulse quickened. He couldn't breathe. He turned toward the sound, his body frozen, his mind racing. But as he stepped closer to the door, everything went still. The laughter stopped. The shadows grew darker, as though the night itself had swallowed them. For a moment, Mark just stood there. He wanted to open the door to look outside, but he was afraid. He was afraid of what he might see. What if they were out there? What if they were watching? He took a shaky breath and stepped back. The apartment was cold now, the air thick with tension. He moved toward the couch, sitting down heavily. His hands were trembling. His mind raced with the images of the children, of the dark figure he had seen in the alley, of the presence that had followed him from Black Hollow's twisted heart. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't escape it. Mark closed his eyes, rubbing his face, trying to block out the rising fear. But deep down, he knew. He knew that whatever had haunted him before, whatever had tried to take him, was still here, still waiting. The cleansing had only pushed it back, but it hadn't gone away. It was always there, always lurking, always watching. The feeling that something would come for him again. The worst part was, Mark wasn't sure he could trust himself anymore. He had seen what the darkness could do. He had felt it. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew in his bones that it was waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, he wasn't sure he'd survive the next time. Mark stood at his apartment window, his gaze distant, unfocused, staring at the empty street below. The city was quiet as it always was at this hour, but the stillness felt different now, more oppressive, like it was hiding something, hiding him. He had been through hell, fighting the darkness that had followed him, the unseen forces that had crept into his life like a cancer, slowly eating away at his reality. And though the cleansing had brought temporary relief, the sense of danger still hung in the air, thick and unyielding. The lights outside flickered again, casting long shadows across the street. Mark's eyes lingered on the movement, his thoughts drifting back to the first time he had noticed the strange events in Black Hollow. The flickering lights, the whispers, the coldness. It had all seemed like nothing more than urban legend at first. But he knew now, without a doubt, that the legends were real. And they were dangerous. His mind wandered to the priest's words, "Sometimes they wait." Mark didn't know if that meant the cleansing had truly worked or if it had only delayed the inevitable. The presence, whatever it was, hadn't gone completely. He could still feel it sometimes, a faint pressure on his chest, a quiet hum at the edge of his awareness. The kids, the tag-along kids, he was certain they weren't gone. Not really. Not forever. It was just a matter of time before they returned. And when they did, he wasn't sure if he'd be able to stop them. His hand gripped the edge of the windowsill, the familiar chill creeping up his spine. He had thought about leaving Black Hollow. Hell, he'd even packed his things a few times, ready to flee. But where would he go? What would he leave behind? The town had become a part of him, a place that, for all its horror, had a strange hold on him. No matter where he went, he'd always feel the weight of it, lurking in the corners of his mind. Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. It was getting late. Too late for this kind of thinking. Too late to try and make sense of it all. But there was something else on his mind, something he couldn't shake. The figure. He had seen it earlier, standing at the edge of the street just past the lamplight, shrouded in shadow. At first, he thought it was just another passerby, just another stranger out in the quiet night. But as he looked closer, something stopped him in his tracks. The figure wasn't walking, wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, unmoving, as if waiting for him. Mark leaned closer to the window, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the details. The figure's outline was indistinct, almost blurry, but he could make out something that made his stomach tighten, those dark eyes. The figure wasn't just standing still. It was watching him, just as the children had, just as the shadowy figures had in the past. Mark's heart skipped a beat. No, this wasn't possible. But as his eyes locked onto the figure, something in him recognized it. The silhouette was too familiar, too haunting to ignore. The person standing across the street wasn't just some stranger. It wasn't a random passerby. It was a face he knew. A face he had seen many times before. It was the boy. The same child he had seen lurking in the shadows, the same one who had whispered to him, the same one who had stared at him with those black eyes. He couldn't see the details clearly from this distance, but the unmistakable figure, the small stature, the way the figure stood motionless, as if waiting, told him everything he needed to know. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled back from the window, his breath caught in his throat. How was this possible? He had been cleansed. The darkness had been driven away. He wasn't supposed to be seeing this. He wasn't supposed to be seeing him again. But there he was. The boy stood in the same spot, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Mark's apartment window. The giggle, soft, sinister, and cold, echoed in the back of Mark's mind again, like an invisible hand pressing against his skull. The presence was back. The darkness had returned. Mark could feel it now, growing closer, creeping in from the edges of his consciousness, the shadow growing larger, suffocating him. He stepped back from the window, his mind racing. What now? His heart pounded, his palms sweating. The ritual had failed. The cleansing had done nothing but push the darkness back, not banish it. The tag-along kids weren't gone, and this time Mark knew they were coming for him again. Mark turned quickly, his hands shaking as he grabbed his jacket and his bag. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this town any longer. The town that had become a prison, a trap. He glanced back toward the window one last time, but the figure was gone, vanished into the night as though it had never been there at all. But Mark knew better now. He knew that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He grabbed the door handle, but before he could leave, he heard it again, the giggle. It was closer this time, behind him, in the room with him. Mark spun around, his breath coming in sharp gasps, but there was nothing. No one. The apartment was empty. The silence returned. except for the laughter which continued to echo, distant but clear, like a reminder. And just before Mark slammed the door behind him and fled into the night, he glanced back once more at the apartment window. The figure was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, still waiting for him. Mark didn't know where he would go. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing for sure. The tag-along kids weren't a legend, and they weren't going to stop until they had him.